Washington, 1953. A young journalist sits alone in a smoke-filled newsroom. The city outside hums with Cold War paranoia. He has just received a story from a source inside the State Department. Shocking revelations about a foreign coup. But before he can print it, the phone rings. A calm voice says, "Run it as we wrote it, not as you found it." He hesitates. The editor nods, almost knowingly. The reporter presses a cigarette to his lips, looks at the typewriter, and realizes this story doesn't belong to him anymore. That was how it began. Not with guns or spies in trench coats, but with pens, cameras, and printing presses. And the mission had a name that history would whisper about for decades: Operation Mockingbird. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you love stories about real spy operations that shape the world from the shadows, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next mission. Give this video a like and share it with someone who loved true spy videos. The Cold War wasn't just fought with bombs and spies, it was fought with words. By the late 1940s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a battle of perception, a war over who controlled the story of the modern world. When the CIA was formed in 1947, its founders understood one thing clearly: controlling information meant controlling reality. Out of that understanding came one of the most sophisticated influence operations ever conceived: Operation Mockingbird, an effort not to censor the media, but to guide it, shape it, and when needed, right it. The atmosphere in post-war America was thick with fear. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and every radio broadcast from Moscow felt like a challenge to American values. At the same time, Washington was learning that battles for hearts and minds could be as decisive as battles for territory. The CIA, under Director Allen Dulles, began exploring new ways to defend democracy, not through soldiers, but through stories. They didn't invent propaganda, they refined it. Instead of forcing media control, they cultivated it, gently, strategically, through relationships, money, and trust. In those early years, the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, became the hub for psychological operations. Its mission was to influence opinion abroad. But soon, those operations crept back home. Foreign and domestic audiences blurred. And so began the silent recruitment, not of agents with guns, but of journalists with typewriters. The idea was simple, elegant, and deeply unsettling. If journalists could shape how the public understood the world, then influencing those journalists meant shaping public reality itself. Reporters traveling abroad were perfect candidates. They had access, cover, and credibility. Many were offered exclusive tips or foreign funding from what appeared to be private institutions, but were, in truth, fronts funded through CIA channels. By 1951, an informal network of journalists was in place across multiple continents. Some knew exactly who they were working for. Others believed they were simply serving their country's interests. Through them, Washington could plant narratives about communist threats, about American aid, about the virtues of Western alliances, all without issuing a single official statement. Internally, CIA officers began calling the participating journalists mockingbirds, voices that would echo what they were told, subtly, persistently, until those echoes became truth. These weren't nameless correspondents. They were writers for some of the most trusted media brands in the Western world. Newsrooms like Time, Life, CBS, and The Washington Post occasionally became conduits for agency influence. Editorial meetings would be quietly steered. Certain headlines would appear at moments that conveniently aligned with intelligence objectives. No editor-in-chief ever signed an official contract with the CIA. That wasn't how Mockingbird worked. It operated through favor, friendship, and fear of losing access. To many inside the press, this wasn't treason. It was patriotism. The Soviet Union had its propaganda networks. America needed its own defense. But that defense blurred into manipulation. And what began as a patriotic mission turned into a machine, one that could silence dissenting voices or elevate convenient truths on command. Influence required funding, and the CIA had plenty. Money flowed through non-profit organizations, foundations, and research institutes. Media outlets received support for cultural journalism, foreign bureaus, or educational exchanges. Each dollar came with invisible strings. A newspaper that accepted this support might unknowingly be echoing CIA talking points. Radio networks broadcasting abroad often received content that had been pre-edited by intelligence officers. Even Hollywood wasn't untouched. Scripts that portrayed the US as strong, moral, and free were encouraged. Films that questioned the government or depicted moral ambiguity often found funding mysteriously withdrawn. The public, meanwhile, consumed it all, unaware that their understanding of world events was being sculpted by an unseen hand. Behind the operation were a few key strategists, not household names, but powerful within Washington's inner circles. They believed information could be the ultimate weapon of peace or war. If the press could be subtly aligned with American foreign policy goals, then coups, interventions, and alliances could unfold with public support instead of outrage. To them, the goal wasn't censorship, it was synchronization. And once synchronization began, it was difficult to stop. By the mid-1950s, Operation Mockingbird extended far beyond the US-European newspapers, Latin American magazines, and even African radio stations began to reflect similar editorial patterns. Often unknowingly, the CIA's influence flowed through foreign intelligence partners and friendly journalists. Stories unfavorable to US interventions were buried. Stories painting the Soviet Union as unstable, oppressive, or expansionist dominated front pages. In many ways, the operation succeeded. Western public opinion largely accepted a single narrative of the Cold War, one where the US was the protector of freedom, and its covert actions were unfortunate necessities. But not everyone inside the press was comfortable. Some correspondents noticed inconsistencies, stories altered without explanation, editors receiving late-night calls before publication. A few began to suspect that their industry was no longer independent. They whispered about government guidance, about editorial briefings. But in that era, questioning national security came with professional suicide, so most stayed silent. Mockingbird had taken flight, and its song blended seamlessly into the sound of free journalism. By the end of the decade, Operation Mockingbird was no longer a small covert program. It was an ecosystem, self-sustaining, invisible, and remarkably effective. The CIA had learned that influence didn't require ownership. It only required trust. If the public trusted the messenger, the message didn't need to be questioned. And so, without any law, decree, or censorship board, a quiet revolution occurred in American media. One where stories were not written to inform, but to align. No journalist ever saw themselves as a spy. Yet together, they became part of the world's most sophisticated information network. The typewriter that lied that night in 1953 wasn't broken. It was repurposed. The world was changing, and Mockingbird had proven one thing beyond doubt. You don't need to control the truth when you can control the storytellers. And soon, that control would begin to crack. In the next chapter, the voices inside the press who had stayed silent for decades would begin to whisper back. And for the first time, the CIA's secret symphony of words would start to echo out of tune. The story of Operation Mockingbird truly unfolds not in secret bunkers or smoky CIA offices, but in the quiet hum of newsrooms. Typewriters clicking, phones ringing, a journalist's instinct sharpened by truth. yet sometimes redirected by invisible strings. During the 1950s and 60s, as the Cold War's ideological war deepened, Washington discovered something far more potent than bombs: the power of perception. If hearts and minds could be shaped, wars could be won before they even began. So, rather than infiltrate governments, the CIA began infiltrating the news. It started small. A favor here, a suggestion there. CIA field officers stationed abroad would meet foreign correspondents, offer them context, background briefings, or even a classified scoop. In return, those journalists would unknowingly, or sometimes knowingly, publish narratives aligned with US interests. The relationship soon grew formal, structured, and deeply woven into global journalism. By the mid-1950s, hundreds of journalists, some aware, others simply used, were working with or for the CIA. Prominent news organizations were quietly penetrated. The agency's reach extended into major American newspapers, magazines, and broadcast networks. Their names were never meant to be revealed, and most weren't, but the influence was undeniable. Some journalists were hired as informants, providing intelligence on foreign contacts, political movements, or the mood of local populations. Others were tasked to plant stories, subtly altering how international events were framed. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, narratives could be shifted overnight. An uprising labeled communist-backed, a coup called democratic restoration. Inside Langley, this vast operation wasn't seen as manipulation. It was information warfare. The idea was simple. If the Soviet Union could weaponize propaganda, America had to do it better, cleaner, smarter, quieter. And so media became another battlefield. But what made Operation Mockingbird so effective wasn't its control of journalists, it was its control of culture. The CIA didn't just shape headlines. It shaped the very stories people believed about freedom, democracy, and danger. American journalists abroad, many working with prestigious press credentials, became intelligence conduits. Magazines that claimed independence often received silent funding through front organizations. A film about resistance in Eastern Europe might have a subtle CIA-approved script revision before release. Even academic journals received funding for anti-communist studies. By the 1960s, this invisible web stretched across continents. The CIA had built a media empire without owning a single newspaper. They simply owned the flow of information, yet not all inside the press were complicit. Some editors grew suspicious. Leaks began to circulate quietly in Washington. A few reporters noticed that certain official leaks always advanced the same political agenda. But to question it openly was professional suicide. And besides, who would believe that the American free press could ever be compromised? Meanwhile, foreign journalists were being pulled in too. Western media agencies had unrivaled credibility worldwide, and their reports shaped how citizens from Cairo to Karachi understood the Cold War. A headline in the New York Times or Time magazine could ripple through the Middle East or South Asia overnight. That power made these publications perfect vehicles for psychological operations. In regions where direct US presence was sensitive, like the Arab world, stories were often ghost-written or quietly funded. Some were printed in local papers that never knew where their content truly originated. The aim was to amplify certain voices and silence others. For the agency, this was not merely propaganda. It was perception management. They didn't have to silence the truth. They only had to flood it with noise. But inside the walls of the CIA, not everyone was comfortable. Some officers feared that manipulating journalism violated everything the agency claimed to protect: freedom of thought, free press, democracy itself. Yet their warnings were ignored. The Soviets are doing it, they were told. We can't afford to lose the narrative. As the operation expanded, a subtle arrogance crept in. Langley believed it could not only report reality, but create it. Every coup, every election, every social movement became a storyline to shape. By the late 1960s, Operation Mockingbird wasn't just a Cold War program. It was the foundation of an information state. What began as a tool to counter Soviet disinformation had grown into something more powerful, more dangerous, and far harder to stop. And while the CIA perfected its methods, Hollywood began to play its part. Though in ways even more subtle. Films didn't just entertain anymore. They instructed, normalized, glorified. Intelligence agencies realized that the camera could be as powerful as any weapon. But that story of how movies, studios, and screenwriters were drawn into the web comes next. Because the next front in Operation Mockingbird wasn't fought with newspapers. It was fought with dreams, lights, and scripts. It's late in the evening in Los Angeles, sometime in the early 1960s. Inside a dimly lit screening room, a man in a suit, not a producer, not a critic, watches the final cut of a new Cold War thriller. He isn't there for entertainment. He's there to ensure that a few key lines, a few subtle changes, align with the narrative of freedom versus tyranny. That man doesn't work for the studio. He works for the CIA. Hollywood has always been America's most powerful storyteller. Its films shape not only what people see, but what they believe. And long before social media, cinema was the ultimate propaganda machine. A medium that could romanticize war, humanize ideology, and rewrite the moral order of global politics. So, when the CIA launched its media infiltration program known as Operation Mockingbird, it didn't stop at newspapers. It set its eyes on the biggest stage in the world, Hollywood. During the 1950s, as Cold War paranoia gripped the public, the agency began forming unofficial relationships with writers, directors, and producers. On the surface, these relationships looked harmless, just advice on scripts or consultations about realism in espionage scenes. In reality, they were strategic partnerships designed to influence what Americans and the world thought about the CIA, communism, and the nature of American power. One of the first goals was simple: protect the agency's image. Films that portrayed the CIA as corrupt, reckless, or morally gray were quietly discouraged. Some scripts mysteriously lost funding. Others were revised after friendly advice from government liaisons. Meanwhile, films that glorified American intelligence, noble agents, heroic missions, ideological clarity were subtly supported, often through third-party influence or hidden studio deals. This invisible hand reached across decades of cinema. Espionage thrillers, war dramas, even romance films carried undertones of us versus them. The enemy was always shadowy, foreign, unknowable, while the American hero stood for truth and democracy. But it wasn't just the CIA. Other branches of the US government soon followed the same playbook. The Pentagon, the State Department, and even NASA began reviewing scripts and granting access to filming locations only if the stories aligned with a certain narrative. Hollywood, once the dream factory, had become a quiet extension of America's psychological warfare division. For the CIA, influence didn't always mean control. It meant partnership. Many in Hollywood believed they were helping the country, contributing to the fight against communism through art. They didn't see themselves as propagandists, but as patriots. This was the brilliance of the system. No one thought they were being manipulated. Everyone believed they were freely expressing truth. But beyond image control, Operation Mockingbird had deeper ambitions. Movies could do what no news article could: emotionally program belief. When a character sacrifices everything for freedom, the audience feels that sacrifice. When a villain carries a foreign accent, they subconsciously associate danger with the other. Through fiction, perception became reality. Consider how the public image of the CIA transformed in these years. Before the 1960s, few Americans knew much about the agency. After a wave of spy movies and patriotic thrillers, the CIA was no longer just a secretive office in Langley. It was a symbol of courage, intelligence, and moral duty. A myth had been born, carefully nurtured by both filmmakers and the agency's invisible advisors. But this cooperation wasn't without controversy. Some filmmakers resisted, sensing that creative independence was being quietly traded for ideological obedience. A few projects, ones that questioned the darker side of intelligence operations, faced stonewalls or security objections. Behind the glamour, a quiet censorship existed, not imposed by force, but by access. If you wanted support, gear, or real government footage, your story had to fit the narrative. As decades passed, the lines blurred even further. By the 1970s, the CIA's cinematic influence evolved from secrecy to sophistication. Instead of planting agents in studios, they simply shaped public taste. If audiences preferred patriotic heroes, studios delivered them. Voluntarily, propaganda had become market-driven, and as television rose in power, the agency adapted again. News programs, talk shows, and documentaries offered subtler platforms for perception control. The same principles applied: shape the narrative, manage the framing, flood the public mind with noise until truth became a matter of preference. Across the world, the effects were immense. Hollywood films exported not just entertainment, but ideology, shaping global perceptions of war, politics, and morality. For many outside the West, it wasn't just the CIA that seemed invincible. It was the idea of America itself, polished and dramatized until it felt divine. Yet behind the curtain, the cracks began to form. As the Vietnam War dragged on and Watergate erupted, people started questioning the purity of American institutions. The journalists the CIA once courted began turning against them. And for the first time, whispers of Operation Mockingbird began surfacing. Not as rumor, but as evidence. A few brave reporters began asking uncomfortable questions. Who was really writing the stories that shaped public opinion? How deep did the influence go? And most importantly, if the media was no longer fully free, what did that mean for democracy itself? The CIA's web was beginning to unravel. The same press it once controlled was now turning its gaze back on the agency. And what it uncovered in the next chapter would expose one of the most profound manipulations of the modern age. It began quietly. A few journalists, a few whispers, documents circulating among Senate aides, and one question echoing through Washington's power corridors. Did the CIA manipulate the press? By the early 1970s, the American public was disillusioned. The Vietnam War had shattered faith in government, and the Watergate scandal was tearing apart the image of moral leadership. Trust in authority was evaporating, and amid that distrust, reporters began revisiting rumors, old, forgotten whispers about an intelligence operation that had blurred the line between journalism and espionage. In 1973, CIA Director James Schlesinger, responding to mounting internal scandals, quietly ordered an internal review. What he uncovered stunned even insiders. A decades-long pattern of covert relationships with journalists, editors, and entire news organizations. The operation, once hidden under names like Mockingbird, was suddenly visible and impossible to deny. A year later, the US Congress launched what would become one of the most significant investigations in American intelligence history. The Church Committee. Headed by Senator Frank Church, this Senate panel sought to uncover the extent of CIA, FBI, and NSA abuses during the Cold War. The hearings exposed domestic spying, assassination plots, and psychological warfare. But one revelation caught the public off guard: the infiltration of the media. Testimonies revealed that the CIA had, for years, enlisted journalists, both American and foreign, to gather intelligence, shape narratives, and distribute agency-approved stories. The committee's staff uncovered classified cables describing relationships with major publications and broadcasters. Though the agency denied any systematic control, the evidence painted a different picture. One of influence so subtle, it blurred into self-censorship. When the report finally surfaced, it was carefully worded, restrained, almost cautious. Only fragments were declassified, and many names were redacted. But even those fragments confirmed what many had long suspected, that Operation Mockingbird was not a conspiracy theory, but a documented strategy. The CIA responded with familiar phrases: national security, necessary measures, countering Soviet disinformation. But behind those words lay a moral crisis. If freedom of the press could be manipulated in a democracy, then what truly separated democracy from the authoritarian states it condemned? The public reaction was one of disbelief mixed with resignation. Some dismissed the findings as exaggeration. Others saw them as proof that truth itself had become collateral damage in the Cold War. As journalists began confronting the legacy of those years, an uncomfortable realization emerged. Many of them had participated unknowingly. Sources they trusted were not diplomats or experts, but agents with hidden agendas. Stories they thought were factual had been enhanced, framed, or quietly edited to serve geopolitical ends. In the following years, the CIA claimed to have ended its direct media operations. In 1976, a new directive was issued, prohibiting the use of accredited American journalists as intelligence assets. It sounded like a clean break, but skeptics weren't convinced. After all, the agency had mastered influence without leaving fingerprints. It no longer needed to own the press. It only needed to feed it. And as the decades passed, the methods simply evolved. Public relations firms, think tanks, and independent analysts began performing the same role once played by covert agents. Narrative management became digital, faster, global, algorithmic. The battlefield had moved online, but the principles of Mockingbird remained alive. Control perception, shape emotion, dominate the story. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, cooperation between the CIA and the entertainment industry became open and institutionalized. Films about intelligence operations, from thrillers to war epics, were now developed with agency consultation, often celebrated as authentic. The line between realism and recruitment blurred completely. Looking back, the Church Committee represented both a triumph and a tragedy, a rare moment of transparency, yet one that changed little. The machinery of influence had grown too sophisticated, too integrated into the structure of modern communication, to be dismantled by a few hearings. Even decades later, investigative journalists occasionally rediscover traces of Mockingbird's DNA. Implanted op-eds, coordinated leaks, and orchestrated coverage during foreign interventions. The names change, the faces rotate, but the pattern remains the same. A government that feared losing control of the truth built a system that could redefine truth itself. And the media, born to challenge power, became one of its most effective tools. Today, in the age of information overload, the question is no longer whether Operation Mockingbird still exists, but whether it ever truly ended. Because the moment truth can be curated, stories can be bought, and narratives can be designed. The song of the mockingbird continues to echo. If you thought Operation Mockingbird was just history, wait until you hear the next one. Subscribe to Spy Shadows, and don't miss the next mission behind the headlines.